At the beginning of this module, I also mentioned that the DLR allows dynamic languages to run, and it allows us to interop with these dynamic languages from C#, languages like IronRuby, IronPython, and Clojure. These languages were written for the DLR, and the IronRuby and IronPython languages, they match the specifications for the Python and Ruby programming languages. Sometimes these dynamic languages are better suited to solve a particular problem. So the ability to call into Python code from C#, for example, can be an advantage and a time saver in some projects. Let me show you an example of calling into some Ruby code from C#. To get started with IronRuby, one of the first things you'll need to do is go to ironruby.net and download the IronRuby binaries. This will give you everything that you need to execute Ruby code. But since you're also working inside of Visual Studio, you might want to also download the Ruby tools for Visual Studio. What this will do is set you up with the ability to create Ruby projects in Visual Studio, to step through Ruby code with the debugger, and of course you have a nice editor in Visual Studio to edit your Ruby code. Once all that is downloaded and installed, you should be able to come in and say File New Project, and one of the items that you'll see in the project menu now is the ability to create different IronRuby projects. What I've done is I've created a console application with IronRuby, and that's here in my solution window, Ruby console, but really the only thing I need is a .rb file, a text file with some Ruby code inside of it. What I want to do is be able to call into this code from C# and see it execute. Inside of my Ruby code, I have a person class defined. First name is set up as a property on this person class, just like we have first name properties on employees. In our C# code, this is a person class with a first name property. It also has a speak method that will put or print out the first name to the console window. And down here is a separate piece of code where I want to walk up to some object called employee and tell it to speak. In the example I'm about to do, I want to be able to instantiate a person class from C# code and actually tell it to speak after setting the first name, but I also want my Ruby code to interact with a C# object that I have defined of type employee and tell it to speak. In order to get this working, I'm going to need some assembly references to assemblies that know how to work with IronRuby code. I can get these by browsing to the IronRuby installation directory, IronRuby 1.1, and then in the bin subfolder, I'm going to pick out 4 assembly references: IronRuby, IronRuby libraries, Microsoft Dynamic, and Microsoft Scripting. I am going to add all of those as references to my project. Now I can see they are in the references, and that will put me at the point where I can start to write some code to bring up first an execution engine for Ruby code. And I can do that by using a factory method called createEngine off the Ruby class. And once I have an engine, I can walk up and tell it to execute the code that's in a specific file. So my Ruby code is in a file called program.rb, and at that point the Ruby code would be off and running. But there's one additional piece of setup that I have to do. Because my Ruby code is going to be looking for an object called employee, and there is no employee object that is constructed or available inside of this scope of Ruby code, I'm going to have to instantiate that in C# code. Remember, I want that to be a C# object, and pass it in to the execution engine so that value is available in Ruby. And the way I can do this is to create a new scope for my execution, and that's done using the createScope method on the engine. And then with the scope, I have the ability to set a variable. I can give that variable a name. That name is going to match what my Ruby code expects, so employee, and then I can give it a value. Let's create a new employee object from C# code, and I'll set the first name equal to Scott C#, just so we know that this is from C# code and it is a C# object that the Ruby code is interacting with. Then I just need to tell the execution engine when it executes this file to use that scope. With that code in place, let's do a quick build. And let's open up our command prompt and run this, and you can see that the Ruby code told the employee to speak, And the employee said, "Hi, my name is Scott C#." Wonderful. Now let's also see if, from C# code, if we can instantiate this person class defined in Ruby and tell it to speak. So let's come back to our program. And so once that Ruby file has executed, I should be able to go up and get a hold of the engine.runtime.globals. And inside of globals, I should be able to find that person class definition. And I can instantiate a person by essentially going to globals and saying person, that symbol. I want to invoke the new method on that person. I want to set the first name of that person equal to Scott, and we'll call it Ruby so that we know we're working with a Ruby object. And then we'll tell that person to speak. Let's do the build. Run the application. And there you can see Ruby calling speak on a C# object, and then a C# object instantiating an object from a Ruby class definition and invoking a method on that object. So we have interop working in both directions.